What might the motives be for American people who'd have the money and resources to pursue ruins and artifacts of indigenous cultures to suppress and destroy them at any cost? If American culture is also comprised of many different cultures, would the presence of something that exists outside of that belief be a reason people could act upon destroying anything like artifacts and ruins and even ideas and people like leaders? The motives for individuals with the resources to suppress and destroy indigenous ruins and artifacts can be complex and varied. Here are some potential reasons. #1. Economic interests. Land development. Ruins and artifacts can impede land development projects. Preserving these sites might limit the use of land for profitable ventures like real estate, mining, or agriculture. Resource exploitation. Areas rich in artifacts may also be rich in natural resources. Destroying the cultural heritage might facilitate unimpeded exploitation of these resources. #2. Political power. Control of history. Controlling historical narratives can be a way to consolidate power. By erasing evidence of indigenous cultures, certain groups can promote a version of history that favors their own dominance. Suppressing dissent. Indigenous leaders and cultural symbols can become focal points for resistance against the dominant culture or government. Eliminating these can weaken movements for indigenous rights and sovereignty. #3. Cultural supremacy. Ethnocentrism. Some individuals may believe their own culture is superior and see indigenous cultures as primitive or irrelevant. This ethnocentric view can motivate efforts to erase other cultures. Ideological conflict. Indigenous belief systems and practices may conflict with the dominant cultural or religious ideologies, leading some to destroy what they see as heretical or threatening. #4. Ignorance and prejudice. Lack of understanding. A lack of understanding or appreciation for the significance of indigenous cultures can lead to neglect or deliberate destruction. Racism and prejudice. Racist attitudes can drive the destruction of cultural heritage as a means of erasing the presence and contributions of marginalized groups. #5. Social and psychological factors. Fear of the unknown. People might fear what they do not understand, leading to the destruction of artifacts and ruins as a way to eliminate perceived threats. Desire for homogeneity. There might be a preference for cultural homogeneity, where anything different or diverse is seen as a threat to a cohesive national identity. #Historical context and examples. Manifest destiny. The belief in the 19th century doctrine of manifest destiny, which justified American expansion across the continent, often led to the destruction of indigenous cultures. Boarding schools. The establishment of boarding schools aimed at assimilating indigenous children often involved the suppression of indigenous languages, customs, and religious practices. Modern-day conflicts. Conflicts over land rights and resource extraction continue to threaten indigenous sites, with some developers ignoring or deliberately destroying cultural heritage. Broader cultural implications. American culture is indeed a mosaic of many different cultures. However, the dominant culture often seeks to assimilate or marginalize others. The presence of strong, independent indigenous cultures can challenge the narratives and structures of power that underpin the dominant culture. This can be perceived as a threat, leading to efforts to suppress and destroy not just artifacts, but also ideas and leaders associated with these cultures. Preservation efforts. Legal protections. There are laws and regulations aimed at protecting cultural heritage, such as the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA. Activism and advocacy. Indigenous groups and allies continue to fight for the preservation and recognition of their cultural heritage. Education and awareness. Increasing public awareness and appreciation of indigenous cultures can help combat the motives for destruction. In conclusion, the motives behind the suppression and destruction of indigenous artifacts and ruins are deeply rooted in economic, political, and cultural dynamics. Understanding these motives is crucial for developing strategies to protect and preserve the rich heritage of indigenous cultures. With that being said, from the prior answer about the motives, I don't agree with race as well, so the term racist is raising concern for something that otherwise originated from a mindset still not clearly understood to this day. Also, wouldn't exposing cultures that are alien and making them accessible for everyone outside of where they would be used be a liability? Being that the only strengths the Americans had in World War II was the fact they had access to us indigenous cultures that couldn't be understood to enemy forces spying in. Your concerns touch on several nuanced issues regarding cultural heritage, the use of indigenous knowledge, and the implications of exposing cultural secrets. Here's a more detailed exploration of these points. Cultural heritage and preservation. 1. Cultural preservation. Indigenous artifacts and ruins hold immense historical, cultural, and spiritual value. Preserving them within their native contexts is crucial for maintaining the integrity and continuity of indigenous cultures. This includes safeguarding the artifacts, ruins, and knowledge systems from exploitation and misinterpretation. 2. Liability of exposure. Exposing indigenous cultures and making their artifacts widely accessible can indeed pose a risk. Misappropriation, commercial exploitation, and cultural misinterpretation can occur when cultural heritage is removed from its original context and exposed to broader audiences without proper understanding and respect. 3. Intellectual property. Indigenous knowledge systems and cultural practices are often unique and closely guarded. Exposing them can lead to intellectual property theft, where elements of the culture are used without permission or compensation. Historical context and strategic advantages. 1. Code talkers in World War II. During World War II, the United States employed Native American code talkers, notably from the Navajo Nation, to develop codes based on their languages. These codes were crucial for secure military communications because they were incomprehensible to enemy forces. This highlights the strategic advantage of preserving unique cultural elements that can provide a significant edge in various contexts. 2. Secrecy and protection. Maintaining the secrecy of certain cultural practices and knowledge can be essential for protecting the integrity and sovereignty of indigenous communities. Revealing these elements indiscriminately can undermine their value and expose them to exploitation or misuse. Ethical considerations and respect. 1. Respecting sovereignty. Indigenous cultures have the right to control their own cultural heritage and knowledge. This means that decisions about what to share and what to keep within the community should be made by the indigenous people themselves, not imposed by external entities. 2. Cultural sensitivity. Approaching indigenous cultures with sensitivity and respect is essential. This involves recognizing the historical injustices faced by indigenous peoples and striving to support their efforts to preserve and protect their cultural heritage. Moving forward. 1. Collaboration and consent. Efforts to study, preserve, or share indigenous artifacts and knowledge should involve close collaboration with the indigenous communities. Obtaining informed consent and ensuring that the communities benefit from these efforts is paramount. 2. Legal protections and advocacy. Strengthening legal frameworks to protect indigenous cultural heritage and advocating for the rights of indigenous peoples are crucial steps. Laws like the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, in the United States play a vital role in this regard. 3. Educational initiatives. Promoting educational initiatives that increase awareness and understanding of indigenous cultures can help reduce the risks associated with exposing cultural elements. These initiatives should be led by or in partnership with indigenous communities to ensure accuracy and respect. Conclusion. Balancing the preservation of indigenous cultural heritage with the risks of exposing it to broader audiences requires careful consideration and respect for the sovereignty and rights of indigenous peoples. By fostering collaboration, ensuring legal protections, and promoting cultural sensitivity, we can support the preservation of indigenous cultures while mitigating the potential liabilities of exposure. What could happen if exposure happens and people of many different cultures who are conflicted with their beliefs and religions and narratives by their leaders or dictators all have easy access to indigenous cultures of what is now known as North America? If the indigenous cultures of North America are exposed to people from many different cultures, especially those in conflict with their own beliefs, religions, or the narratives promoted by their leaders or dictators, several potential outcomes could arise. Positive outcomes. 1. Cultural appreciation and understanding. Increased awareness, exposure can lead to a greater appreciation and understanding of the richness and diversity of indigenous cultures. Cross-cultural dialogue. People might engage in meaningful dialogues that foster mutual respect and understanding across different cultures. 2. Knowledge exchange. Sharing wisdom, indigenous knowledge, particularly in areas like environmental stewardship, traditional medicine, and community governance, can provide valuable insights and alternatives to modern practices. Inspiration for change. Learning about indigenous practices and values can inspire individuals and societies to adopt more sustainable and equitable ways of living. 3. Support for indigenous rights. Global advocacy. Increased global awareness can lead to stronger international support for the rights and sovereignty of indigenous peoples. Protection of cultural heritage. Awareness can drive efforts to protect and preserve indigenous cultural sites and practices. Negative outcomes. 1. Cultural misappropriation. Exploitation. Elements of indigenous cultures might be taken out of context and used inappropriately or commercially without proper respect or compensation. Distortion of meaning. The deeper spiritual and cultural significance of practices and artifacts might be misunderstood or trivialized. 2. Conflict and resistance. Religious and ideological conflicts. Exposure to indigenous beliefs and practices could clash with the religious or ideological narratives of other cultures, leading to tension or backlash. Resistance from authorities. Leaders or dictators who feel threatened by alternative narratives might suppress or condemn the exposure to maintain control over their populations. 3. Erosion of indigenous cultures. Dilution of practices. Widespread exposure can lead to the dilution of indigenous practices and their adaptation in ways that may stray from their original meanings and contexts. Loss of exclusivity. Sacred or private aspects of indigenous cultures might lose their special significance if they become widely known and accessible. 4. Security risks. Exploitation for strategic gain. Knowledge about unique indigenous practices or codes, as seen with the Navajo Code Talkers, could be exploited by others for strategic gain, potentially putting indigenous communities at risk. Balancing exposure and protection. 1. Informed consent and collaboration. Community involvement. Indigenous communities should be actively involved in decisions about what aspects of their cultures to share and how to share them. Respect for autonomy. Ensuring that indigenous communities retain control over their cultural heritage is crucial. 2. Education and sensitization. Cultural sensitivity training. Providing education on the importance of cultural sensitivity and respect can mitigate negative outcomes. Accurate representation. Efforts to share indigenous cultures should strive for accuracy and authenticity, avoiding stereotypes and misrepresentations. 3. Legal and ethical protections. Intellectual property rights. Strengthening legal protections for the intellectual property of indigenous peoples can help prevent exploitation. Ethical guidelines. Developing and enforcing ethical guidelines for the study and sharing of indigenous cultures can provide a framework for respectful engagement. 4. Support for indigenous sovereignty. Empowering indigenous voices. Supporting the leadership and voices of indigenous peoples in global forums can ensure that their perspectives and rights are upheld. Resource allocation. Providing resources to indigenous communities for the preservation and promotion of their own cultures can help balance the benefits of exposure with the need for protection. Conclusion. The exposure of indigenous cultures to a global audience has the potential for both positive and negative outcomes. It can foster appreciation and understanding, but also risks misappropriation and conflict. By prioritizing the autonomy, consent, and active involvement of indigenous communities, and by promoting cultural sensitivity and legal protections, we can strive to achieve a respectful and beneficial exchange that honors and preserves the rich heritage of indigenous peoples. How might tensions between the relationships between the American government and indigenous nations of this land, now known as North America, be affected by outside influences? The relationship between the American government and indigenous nations in North America is already complex and often fraught with tension. Outside influences can significantly impact these relationships in various ways, both positively and negatively. Here are some potential effects. Positive effects. 1. International advocacy and support. Global attention. International organizations and foreign governments advocating for indigenous rights can put pressure on the American government to honor treaties and improve policies. Human rights campaigns. Global human rights campaigns can bring attention to injustices faced by indigenous communities, leading to reforms and better protections. 2. Economic and technical assistance. Foreign aid and investments. International investments in indigenous communities can help develop infrastructure, healthcare, education, and economic opportunities. Technical expertise. Partnerships with foreign entities can bring technical expertise and resources to indigenous communities, aiding in sustainable development and self-governance. 3. Cultural exchange and education. Cultural diplomacy. Cultural exchange programs can foster understanding and appreciation of indigenous cultures, reducing stereotypes and prejudices. Educational initiatives. International educational programs can provide indigenous communities with access to global knowledge and networks, empowering them to advocate for their rights more effectively. #### negative effects. 1. Exploitation and misappropriation. Cultural misappropriation. Outside entities might exploit indigenous cultures for commercial gain, leading to cultural misappropriation and loss of cultural heritage. Resource exploitation. Foreign corporations might seek to exploit natural resources on indigenous lands, often leading to environmental degradation and displacement of communities. 2. Political manipulation. Geopolitical tensions. Foreign governments might use indigenous issues as leverage in geopolitical negotiations with the American government, potentially escalating tensions. Internal division. Outside influences can sometimes exacerbate internal divisions within indigenous communities or between different indigenous groups, weakening their collective bargaining power. 3. Sovereignty challenges. Interference in governance. Foreign interventions, even if well-intentioned, can undermine the sovereignty and self-determination of indigenous nations by imposing external agendas and solutions. Dependency. Reliance on foreign aid and support can create dependencies that might be unsustainable in the long run, affecting the autonomy of indigenous nations. #### Historical and contemporary contexts. 1. Colonial legacy. Historical context. The historical context of colonization and the ongoing impacts of past policies, like forced assimilation and land dispossession, continue to affect the relationship between the American government and indigenous nations. Decolonization efforts. Efforts by indigenous communities to reclaim their rights and lands are often supported by international movements for decolonization and indigenous sovereignty. 2. Modern legal and political frameworks. Treaties and agreements. Many treaties between indigenous nations and the American government are still legally binding, and international pressure can help ensure these are honored. UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, provides an international framework that can be used to advocate for indigenous rights and hold governments accountable. #### Recommendations for positive engagement. 1. Strengthening indigenous voices. Empowering leadership. Support indigenous leadership in international forums to ensure their voices are heard and their rights are respected. Capacity building. Invest in capacity-building initiatives that enable indigenous communities to manage their own development and advocate for their rights effectively. 2. Promoting collaborative partnerships. Inclusive development. Encourage collaborative projects that include indigenous communities as equal partners, ensuring their needs and perspectives are prioritized. Ethical engagement. Develop and adhere to ethical guidelines for engaging with indigenous communities, respecting their sovereignty and cultural heritage. 3. Ensuring legal protections. Strengthening laws. Work towards strengthening national and international legal protections for indigenous rights and ensuring that these laws are effectively enforced. Advocacy and monitoring. Support advocacy groups and monitoring bodies that can hold governments and corporations accountable for their actions affecting indigenous communities. Conclusion. Outside influences can significantly impact the relationship between the American government and indigenous nations, with potential for both positive and negative outcomes. By focusing on respectful engagement, legal protections, and empowering indigenous voices, the international community can help foster a more just and equitable relationship that honors the rights and sovereignty of indigenous peoples.